Welcome to our 15th public lecture in the Humanities Research Centre's 2022 Works That Shaped the World series here at the ANU. This year's lecture series is focused on religion. And let me begin by paying our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, whose traditional land the ANU is built upon, as is St. Mark's National Theological Centre of the School of Theology at Charles Sturt University, also located in Canberra and home of today's speaker, Bernard Doherty, PhD and Master of the Occult. Bernard is course director at Charles Sturt School of Theology, also an adjunct lecturer at the University of Notre Dame, Sydney, and an honorary research fellow at King's College, London. Bernard's research interests include new religious movements, Australian religious history, church and state issues, and religion and the media. He's also the co-editor with myself of the Journal for the Academic Study of Religion, the publication of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion. So I'm very pleased to welcome Bernard to introduce us to a work that shaped the world, William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Okay, I'll get right into it. Okay. In her raucously irreverent 2017 memoir, Priestdaddy, American poet Patricia Lockwood narrated her unconventional childhood, growing up and coming of age in a Catholic presbytery with a married Catholic priest for a father. She describes her dad, Father Greg Lockwood, as a gun-toting, guitar-riffing Catholic priest who had been one of several married men who entered the Catholic priesthood during the 1980s via a canonical loophole from other churches, in his case, the Lutheran Church. Regarding the topic at hand, that is William Peter Blatty's 1971 novel, The Exorcist, and director William Friedkin's 1973 film adaptation, is Lockwood's description of her father's unlikely conversion to Christianity. Contrasting her father's irreligious attitudes prior to his conversion with her mother's natural, deeply embedded Irish-American devotional piety, Lockwood writes, "He was not going to be shut up in small spaces and forced to do tricks on command. Instead, he joined the Navy and plunged into the ocean in that smallest and most obedient space of all, a nuclear submarine called the USS Flying Fish. And it was here, in the middle of perfect claustrophobia, that a moment of his life split open and spilled the nuclear green glow of infinity all over him, and he became his origin story. It occurred during a late-night viewing of The Exorcist. The room was dark and that eerie pea soup light was pouring down. And all around him, men in sailor suits were getting the bejesus scared out of them. And the bejesus flew into my father like a dart into a bullseye. He saw the little girl's head spin around to consider the hidden half of things, and his head spun around likewise. Over the course of that patrol, the men watched The Exorcist 72 times. And on the very next patrol, my father converted." Lockwood's dramatic account of her father's conversion is by no means unique in highlighting the dramatic reactions which many had to the film. One can produce numerous similar stories. In a different context, for example, religious historian Robert Orsi, in his groundbreaking 2016 book, History and Presence, highlights the impact of the film on the infamous comic book illustrator and lapsed Catholic, Robert Crumb, who told a French journalist, "Remember that film, The Exorcist, that came out in 1973? I went to see it not knowing what it was about or what to expect. I was completely terrified by that movie. I felt really stupid, but it got to me in such a deep way that I realized that I'm not past all that Catholic crap at all. Even though I think it's stupid, it's still there." Orsi, who perhaps more than any other contemporary American religious historian has probed the mindset of mid-20th century American Catholicism, poignantly remarked, with his usual candor about his own embeddedness within this context, "What makes The Exorcist, written by Catholic, Jesuit-educated William Peter Blatty, so terrifying for Catholics brought up in the middle years of the 20th century is I've never been able to bring myself to see the film, deeply embodied sense of the really realness of the supernatural, good and evil. In this sense and this context, The Exorcist was a documentary based on a true story, as Catholic gossip at the time maintained, rather than a work of fiction, although of course Catholics also knew it was fiction. In this presentation, I want to interrogate Orsi's observation here and suggest that studying the background and reception to The Exorcist offers an intriguing lens which brings into focus several facets of American Catholic vernacular religion at the end of the long 1960s. As the examples of both Lockwood and Crumb demonstrate, whether one likes it or not, The Exorcist occasioned and continues to occasion a religious response among the general public. Its themes also touched on a series of fault lines, not only in wider American culture and society, but particularly within the kaleidoscopic world of American Catholicism at the end of the long 1960s. Among horror films and books, The Exorcist has attracted a disproportionate amount of commentary from a variety of perspectives, ranging from gender studies and psychoanalysis through to the histories of medicine and science. However, in today's presentation, my scope is more limited. I aim to delve into two aspects of the book and the film phenomena in order to highlight its, some might say, unfortunate cultural significance, especially in the United States and particularly among Roman Catholics. First, I will look at the background of the book and film and position it within the type of ethnic melting pot Catholicism from which its author, William Peter Blatty, emerged, and its vernacular beliefs about the devil and exorcism. In particular, I will focus on the type of Catholic supernaturalism which Blatty drew on in writing The Exorcist and his own ambivalent relationship with this type of devotional Catholicism. Secondly, I'll examine the reaction to the book and the film among Catholic audiences, focusing on the extensive commentary provided on the film by a number of Catholic priests at the time, all of whom found themselves pastorally and professionally challenged by the film's impact in various contexts. Born in 1928 in New York, William Peter Blatty was the son of Lebanese Maronite migrants, though he was largely raised by his mother in what could best be called pressed circumstances. Growing up the son of a devout migrant, Blatty later reflected on some of the types of religious behaviour he was exposed to and the effect it had on him, describing a family friend he referred to as Crazy Mary, who visited 7 churches a day and saw Our Lady of Fatima in alphabet soup. Blatty imbibed the type of devotional Catholicism which was part and parcel of the experience of many immigrant Catholics growing up in New York during the 1940s and 1950s, so richly described by Robert Orsi. But he did not appear to swallow it whole, and there always remained something of the skeptic in how Blatty approached religion, or as how he preferred to put it, the doubting Thomas. Regardless, what Blatty did absorb was an abiding sense that the presence of the supernatural was deeply felt by many. And while he could not easily assent to such a belief himself, he clearly yearned for this. Along with Blatty's sense of this experience of the immanence of the transcendent, moreover, was an acute sense of its opposite. That is, that the presence of evil, along with the experiences of hunger and poverty, had stalked migrant Catholics to America. Writing in his cultural history, Satan in America, The Devil We Know, W. Scott Poole captures this environment well when he describes American Catholic beliefs about personal evil in the early to mid 20th century. And Poole writes, the devil continued to haunt Roman Catholicism in the post-war years. By the 1950s, the Roman Catholic Church represented by far the largest Christian tradition in the United States. Until that era, the American Catholics had, in many respects, remained sequestered within their own world of ethnic neighbourhoods, parishes, and parochial schools. A strong devotional piety flourished, and along with it, a powerful belief in the power of Satan. Numerous folk beliefs of European origin remained strong, passed down to children from family members and parish priests. Aspects of this kind of vernacular religious belief are scattered throughout The Exorcist, from allusions to Father Karras's observations about his mother's traditional devotions, such as First Friday devotions to the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to darker aspects, not least reference to the famous case of an exorcism which took place in Ealing, Iowa in 1928, and later became the subject of the best-selling devotional pamphlet, Begone Satan. Writing on this pamphlet, which can be readily purchased even today at some Catholic bookshops, Poole observed how it entered powerfully into the American consciousness and became a template for later descriptions of the effects of demonic possession, including in The Exorcist. Moreover, and more importantly in the present context, the pamphlet offered the reader a tour of how popular Catholic devotionalism lived in harmony with concepts of the demonic. Despite this, it would take something more than this type of demon-haunted devotionalism to pierce through Blatty's skeptic shell. Blatty drew on begone Satan for some of the dramatic manifestations of the demonic described in The Exorcist. It is the proximate source of Regan's gruesome visage while possessed, her foul language and preternatural movements, the infamous spider walk. But the pamphlet left Blatty cold. Writing in 1974, he said, "The tone of the pamphlet seemed so overtly credulous, so replete with pietistic asides and exclamations, that it turned me not off." It was not, however, in this world of his mother's ethnic devotional piety, however, that Blatty was to find some satisfaction for his yearning for the transcendent, but rather in his long-term association with the Society of Jesus in several contexts. Blatty was, from an early age, formed by the Jesuits, first at Brooklyn Preparatory School and then at Georgetown, at one stage even considering a vocation with the Society. It was in this intellectual world, with its network of colleges and institutions scattered across America, that Blatty found the kind of inquiring Catholicism which gelled with his skeptical bent. It was also in this Jesuit context that in 1949, Blatty began to hear what he described as some rather bizarre phenomena that had been bruited about on the Georgetown campus. These bizarre phenomena related to a 1949 case of alleged possession in St. Louis. According to Blatty's account, on August 20, 1949, he came across an article on the front page of the Washington Post by reporter Bill Brinkley with the title, "Priest Frees Mount Rainier Boy Reportedly Held in Devil's Grip." This article, which opened by describing the event as perhaps one of the most remarkable experiences of its kind in recent religious history, described the exorcism of a 14-year-old boy, which had recently taken place in St. Louis. The Washington Post account contained, in embryo, a number of features of Blatty's later story, including the cursing and Latin phraseology, self-propelling bedroom furniture, a battery of ultimately inconclusive medical diagnostic texts, and a Jesuit exorcist or two. More importantly, however, it had a profound effect on Blatty's own spirituality. He writes, "The article impressed me, and how coolly understated that is. I wasn't just impressed, I was excited. For here at last, in this city, in my time, was tangible evidence of transcendence. If there were demons, there were angels, and probably a God and a life everlasting." The case in question is usually referred to in the literature as either the Mount Rainier or the St. Louis exorcism, with two separate attempts at solemn exorcism taking place on the same boy. The second, more famous attempt took place over an extended period of 35 days. This case, involving a handful of Jesuit priests from St. Louis, chiefly the then parish priest of the University Church, Father William Bowden, became the stuff of urban legend, particularly in Jesuit circles, a point to which I'll return. The details of this case have become the subject of what American scholar of religion Joseph Laycott has aptly described as a veritable cottage industry, with a number of full-length studies by journalists trying to ascertain the facts behind the case. What is important to note here is that Blatty's dramatisation of it, though I'll return to the actual case later. Over the years, Blatty continued to read quite extensively in available material about demonic possession. Through various writing jobs over the next 2 decades, the story continued to haunt Blatty, and he finally settled down to write in the late 1960s. Beginning in 1969, Blatty began research in earnest, reading everything he could find on the subject and, more importantly, following up various Jesuit contacts. After hitting several brick walls, Blatty eventually obtained contact details for Father Bowden, who he subsequently wrote to about the case. Bowden's reply was courteous but cautious, and it alerted Blatty to a number of things. First, it confirmed the existence of a diary, which Bowden and the other priests involved had kept. Second, it suggested that Bowden was already aware of a degree of exaggeration and embellishment taking place regarding the events in question, the Jesuit sewing circle that kind of emerged. Third, it alluded to Bowden's own attitude towards the case. Bowden states, "My own thoughts were that much good might have come if the case had been reported, and people had come to realise the presence and activity of the devil is something very real, and possibly never more real than at the present time. I can assure you that of one thing, the case in which I was involved was a real thing. I had no doubt about it then, and I have no doubts about it now. Blatty eventually got hold of the diary, no small feat at the time, though it's now readily available on the internet. And this added further colour to the novel and eventually the film. The novel appeared in 1971 and spent 60 weeks on the bestseller list. Through a series of rather dubious dealings, William Friedkin was brought on to direct the film version. The rest, as they say, is history. When the film version appeared on Boxing Day 1973, it became an instant cinematic and cultural phenomenon, causing a huge reaction amongst audiences. According to film critic writer Stephen Tropiano, in its first 5 weeks, The Exorcist took in over $10 million at the box office. In New York, Boston, and several other cities, moviegoers awaited for up to 4 hours in the freezing cold to see the film. Furthermore, the film profited from word of mouth and stories, most unsubstantiated, that audience members were running out of the theatre in terror, passing out in the aisle, and having heart attacks. The film was not, however, a critical success, and many reviewers panned it. Most acerbic, perhaps, was the New Yorker's Pauline Kael, whose review asked a question which has proved remarkably apt in the time since. Kael called the film the biggest recruiting poster the Catholic Church has seen since the sunnier days of Going My Way and the Bells of St. Mary's, but went on to ask the poignant question, are American Catholics willing to see their faith turned into a horror show? This question brings me to the reception and reaction to the film amongst American Catholics. While some clergy were relaying disturbing reports of the impact of Blatty's book on their parishioners in the lead up to the film's release, within a month of the film hitting screens, its full visceral impact was being felt, and the American Catholic clergy were becoming worried and beginning to weigh the consequences of the film's graphic depiction of an arcane and largely abandoned rite within the church. On January 28, 1974, the New York Times ran a front-page article entitled Exorcist Adds Problems for Catholic Clergymen, in which they interviewed a series of priests about the film's impact. Among a handful of priests interviewed by journalist Edward Fisk were Father Richard Woods, a young Dominican then teaching at Loyola University in Chicago, and Jesuit psychiatrist at Georgetown, Father Juan Cortez, both of whom were to feature in the theological furor that followed the film, and both of whom had skin in the game. Father Wood's comments were informed by a wider background. Over the preceding years, Woods, a priest with sociological training, had published 2 books pertinent to the topic at hand, The Occult Revolution, a Christian Meditation in 1971, and The Devil in 1973, as well as penning a thoughtful article in the Archdiocese of Chicago's official organ, Chicago Studies, with the indicative title, The Possession Problem, or Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Exorcism but Were Afraid to Ask. Writing as a young Dominican priest seeking to engage with the new generation, Woods was enthused by the spirit of the Second Vatican Council and its reforming agenda. Woods informed Fisk that, to his mind, The Exorcist reflects a view that you are doing people a spiritual favour if you scare the hell out of them. Going further to say, this was the way the church was when Blatty was a senior at Georgetown, but it's not the way the church is today. Teaching at Loyola University, Woods, like other Catholic clergy at the time, observed firsthand the fruits of the wider occult revival which swept American popular culture over the 1960s and 1970s. But he was also aware of where he had come from in terms of the American church, and that amid this climate of youthful spiritual experimentation, which he was encountering amongst his students, there remained an ambivalence amongst Catholics. This was drawn out in Wood's more considered writings. Writing in the opening of his popular book, The Devil, before the release of the film version of The Exorcist, Woods pinpointed the atmosphere the book evokes amongst older Catholics, and indeed those who were coming of age in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when he observed that the emphatic presence of the Exorcist and its proliferating imitators gives many contemporary Catholics a slightly suffocating feeling of nostalgia mixed with nausea. Woods went on to describe the status of the question of the devil as it stood in contemporary Catholic theological discussion, further noting, after all, wasn't that cosmic boogeyman exorcised for good by the scripture scholars and the Second Vatican Council? Woods finished this opening salvo by adding, for rhetorical effect, And rightly so, we add, recalling the horror stories perpetuated on generations of unsuspecting school children by good sisters and irascible but lovable old pastors. Woods, echoing a strand of sociology at the time, which saw the occult revival as largely faddish, had already offered a sophisticated account of what he thought was taking place in wider culture and its enthusiasm for the occult and the demonic in his 1971 book, The Occult Revolution. But in The Devil, he was also writing in a somewhat apologetic mode. The book was published by the Thomas More Association. And as a priest in church ministry who recognised the pastoral implications which the exorcist phenomena had brought to the surface. Wood had experienced this pastoral challenge firsthand, noting tellingly that in less than 6 months, 7 persons requested that I exorcise them, or rather their demons, having been convinced in at least 4 cases that they were possessed after reading or hearing about The Exorcist. This, it must be remembered, was written before the film version of The Exorcist had even been released. As Wood told Fisk less than a year later, I've received dozens of calls from people who are horribly frightened or so confused that they had begun to lose their grip on reality. Wood's ultimate conclusion on the exorcist phenomena was clear, and taking aim at another priest's positive remarks about the film, he emphatically remarked, I do not think that the new awareness of the supernatural gained from The Exorcist will do great good, any more than stock Dracula movies do, which also replete with priests, crosses, and other symbols of the sacred. But unlike the Dracula films, The Exorcist can do a great amount of harm by convincing the credulous and fearful that demonic possession is an explanation for the felt presence of evil, that the power of Satan is greater than it really is, that God is silent when we need him most. While wearing his scholar's hat, Woods could dismiss the reaction as occasioned by novels and the flim-flam world of commercial occultism. This did not take away from the fact sociologists at the time were finding that belief in the devil and his activity in the world was on the rise, something Wood himself acknowledged after straw polling his students in class. Indeed, the kind of sociological data emerging from national polls at the time, it is unsurprising that Woods wasn't the only priest in the Archdiocese of Chicago to write a book on the devil that year. A few months earlier, in February 1973, the one-man demographic barometer of American Catholic life, sociologist Father Andrew Greeley, had penned an opinion piece in the New York Times in which he waxed lyrical about Pope Paul VI's controversial Christmas season homily of late November 1962, in which he slapped down progressive theologians who were moving to deny the personal existence of the devil. I'll talk about this homily more later. Greeley followed this up in 1974 by a full-length study, a book entitled The Devil, You Say, Man and His Personal Devils and Angels, in which he drew conclusions similar to Wood's. Greeley was equal parts scathing and dismissive of The Exorcist, opining and a passing swipe at the end of the introduction to his book. This book was conceived and written before the bizarre cult of demonology stirred up by The Exorcist swept the country. As I hope to be clear from my text, my approach has nothing to do with the cheap, exploitative sensationalism of that third-rate cinematic shocker. Both these sociologist priests might have been scathing of The Exorcist, but not all priests were so negative, and among Catholics, the work attracted its advocates. One of them was Father John J. Nicola, who was credited on the film as a technical advisor. Father Nicola was a parish priest and former seminary lecturer, whose positive review of the book had occasioned Blatty to invite him to lunch in New York and led to him being hired as a technical advisor for the film. During the early 1970s, Father Nicola was the priest in charge at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and had been brought in to teach a class on the occult by the Catholic University of America for adult education. He did, however, have another, more curious, unofficial role within the church, and one which meant he took an active interest in the substance of Blatty's novel. During the period between the 1960s and 1980s, Nicola was principal investigator for the American Catholic bishops of suspected cases of demonic possession and other things that go bump in the night. How one gets assigned such a role relates back to Nicola's time at St. Mary of the Lake Seminary in Mundelein, Illinois, during the early 1950s, when a class assignment on the topic of superstition opened Nicola to a number of questions. He subsequently wrote further on the occult for 2 postgraduate dissertations. though on the condition set by the seminary rector that if anything unusual or odd occurred, he was to report it immediately and needed to be prepared to discontinue the work on the thesis in these circumstances. Nicola's own account of this is published in his 1973 book, Diabolical Possession and Exorcism, published by the Traditionalist Tan Books, a publisher which has sought more than any other to preserve unchanged the theological patrimony of the preconciliar American church. If you want conservative preconciliar Catholicism, Tan Books is your place to go. While having a priest on hand to investigate paranormal phenomena might seem to modern Catholics a bit weird, interest in parapsychological phenomena was by no means novel amongst priests, or more generally during the 1960s and 1970s. Indeed, a large part of the occult revival was a wider interest in the paranormal in various kinds of parapsychological abilities, which featured heavily in the background of Blatty's novels, things like ESP. Among Catholics whose tradition of investigating preternatural and supernatural phenomena witnessed in cases of canonization dated back to at least the Counter-Reformation, interest in parapsychology was quite widespread. Father Nicola was, however, by no means credulous, and his book is a fairly good example of the cautious approach taken by the Church in assessing diabolical phenomena. In particular, the application of the Aristotelian principle of economy as it applied in theology. As Nicola writes, when a natural and ordinary explanation is possible, we don't have recourse to unusual or extraordinary causes, even though the potentiality and the possibility are always there. Proceeding in this manner, Nicola's own investigations into such phenomena would follow a process of confirming or eliminating such things as fraud or trickery and natural scientific causes, including psychological explanations, before moving to parapsychological causes and finally preternatural or supernatural causes. In this regard, he was very similar to Father Damien Karras in The Exorcist. Given this rather unique position, what did Father Nicola think about the film? In his initial review of Blatty's book, he had been very positive, and Nicola's own book began with a promising start quoted on this slide. Nicola's feelings about the film were more complex, however. Initially slated for the part of Father Karras's camp fellow Jesuit, Father Jack Dyer, the piano-playing socialite priest, Nicola had pulled out over the decision to include the infamous crucifix masturbation scene within the film, noting how Blatty and Friedkin's lurid imaginations had inserted this disgusting scene to titillate the morons in the audience. These scruples did not, however, prevent Nicola's involvement behind the scenes. He was responsible for training Jason Miller and Max von Sydow in the handling of clerical clothing and religious articles, something the former altar boy Miller was more accustomed to than the skeptical Protestant von Sydow. Overall, Father Nicola considered his involvement in the film to have been a positive, noting that at least 3 people connected with the production returned to the sacraments and the practice of their religion as a result of their reflection on the story. Indeed, this evangelistic function seems to be the chief justification offered by all the priests involved with the film. Nicola could be accused of some hyperbole in his comments, but he was not completely wrong, and the film's mass appeal was considerable. So what of the other priests involved with the film, in particular the Jesuits? Given the pride of place of the Society of Jesus occupies in The Exorcist, as well as their flagship institution, Georgetown University, it is unsurprising that the Jesuits had much to say about the film, though by no means all positive. In an early review of the book, which appeared in the Catholic Commonweal magazine in 1972, Fordham-based Jesuit theologian Father Raymond Schroff called the film part commercial gimmick shocker, part problem of evil think piece, and, with encouragement of good priest friends, part old-fashioned Christian apologetic. The book was a piece of Catholic nostalgia of more service to the cause of superstition than to true religion. As was later the case with Woods, Schroff objected to the depiction of the church as outdated and preconciliar, if not pre-Enlightenment in tone. While Schroff's critique delved into issues of Blatty's writing style, his central concern was that the book, and by implication the forthcoming movie's shock value, should not be confused with religious awe, and that neither should be given the imprimatur of the church. I'm afraid, Schroff opined, that the attempt to solicit priestly blessings for the Exorcist book and film reminds me too much of the early days of Playboy and when Mr. Hefner sought priests and ministers to baptize his little cultural package into respectability by submitting articles and friendly letters. Chief in Schroff's sights here was fellow Jesuit Father William O'Malley, who replaced Father Nicola in the role of Jack Dyer. O'Malley responded a month later to Schroff's critique, accusing him of being out of touch with the Catholic laity, whom O'Malley suggested were far more at home in the pre-conciliar church than cutting-edge theologians like Schroff, or indeed himself, would often like to believe, suggesting, I fear that Father Schroff may be cloaking himself in a Vatican II triumphalism, as sterile as a post-Tridentine triumphalism. And tellingly, Vatican II has only touched the surface of the people of God. O'Malley's defence, however, was something of a minority opinion in Jesuit circles, especially after the film version appeared. The Jesuit America magazine, for example, ran extended coverage in its February 1974 issue, where a series of critics, Jesuits and lay people, took aim at the film. Father Robert Lauder, for instance, noted that for the viewer, it will bombard him, jolt him, frighten him, and send him from the theatre knowing that he has been entertained by real professionals, but that the film will probably not further or deepen his experience of the tension of the transcendent. While none of the reviews was completely negative, neither were they ringing endorsements. The most intriguing responses to the Exorcist phenomena from Jesuit circles, however, came from two former Jesuits. Before Blatty had resolved to write The Exorcist in 1960, a then Jesuit scholastic was undertaking studies in classics and English literature at St. Louis University and was working on a book which appeared in 1968 entitled The Devil, Demonology and Witchcraft, which contributed to a storm which was raging in Catholic theological circles in the background while the Exorcist phenomena was playing out in wider American society. The aspiring priest's name was Henry Ansgar Kelly. And being a member of the St. Louis University Jesuit community, he had heard the same rumours about the 1949 St. Louis exorcism from other priests, which Blatty had, and decided to interview the principal parties. Before turning to Kelly's account, however, it is necessary for me to take a slight theological detour. As alluded to above, alongside the Catholic revival of interest in the devil alluded to by sociologists like Greeley and Woods, were a series of wider theological debates which had emerged from the implementation of the Vatican II reforms. While the theological debate centred on a variety of issues, one such debate which is not often discussed was regarding the ontological reality of the devil, which over the late 1960s and into the mid-1970s attracted front-page news in a variety of countries, not just because of The Exorcist, though the book and the film certainly helped things along here. Among theologians, the skeptical wing had gained prominence in the 1960s. As historian Jeffrey Burton Russell observes, they tended to attack belief in the devil on a number of grounds, ranging from doctrine to social practice. However, it was in the area of scripture that their arguments had the greatest weight and caused the greatest disquiet amongst conservatives, ultimately leading to a backlash within the Vatican itself. This small coterie of skeptical scholars, including Herbert Haag in the German-speaking milieu, the Jesuits Henry Ansgar Kelly and the aforementioned Father Juan Cortez in the United States, and the French Dominican Christian de Kock, marshalled a fairly standard set of arguments related to the philosophical problem of evil, the interpretation of scripture and its witness about the devil, aspects of doctrinal development, particularly the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council, and socially destructive nature of beliefs about the demonic and witchcraft. Within Europe, it was Haag's book, it was in Europe, it was Haag who occasioned the most spirited reaction. And the picture on the slide is of Herbert Haag with Hans Kuhn. Indeed, it is generally held that his 1969 book, Abschied vom Teufel, Farewell to the Devil, was the instigating factor in Pope Paul VI's 1972 homily, the same homily discussed by Father Andrew Greeley, in which he reaffirmed Catholic teaching on the ontological reality of the devil. And here are just a couple of quotes from Pope Paul VI's homily. The combined efforts of this reform group of theologians reached its apogee in the period between 1974, when Haag's edited volume, Teufelsglaube, Belief in the Devil, appeared in German, and 1975, where the reform-minded journal Concilium published an issue dedicated to Satan, in which the skeptical position was on full display. The reaction to this theological dissent from the Vatican was swift and decisive, and in 1975, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a document entitled Christian Faith and Demonology, which discussed, among other things, exorcism and the devil, and reiterated the traditional position taken by Pope Paul VI in 1972. The teaching of this document has been reaffirmed to varying degrees by each pope since. How this all relates to The Exorcist, other than highlighting in a particularly stark way how debates over the devil were anything but dead letter in official Catholicism, ties in with its major Anglophone proponent, Henry Kelly. Kelly's position is probably best stated in the preface to the English edition of his 1968 book, which appeared under the far more provocative title of Toward the Death of Satan, The Growth and Decline of Christian Demonology. Here, Kelly noted emphatically, the discussion that follows is to be read in the light of the possibility or even the likelihood that the devil and demons, that is, fallen angels of traditional belief, do not exist. Kelly had been moving towards this perspective since at least the mid-1960s, but what is more important for the present circumstances was Kelly's own situation at this time, which placed him in a quite unique position with reference to the entire question of diabolical possession prior to the furor occasioned by either the book or the film of The Exorcist. As mentioned, Kelly interviewed the principal parties to the 1949 St. Louis possession in the early 1960s, though at the time of the publication of the first edition of this book, he had suppressed details of his interviews at the request of the priests in question. By 1974, however, Kelly had left the Jesuits and felt that in the wake of the Exorcist phenomenon, it was essential to publicise the facts of the matter. According to Kelly's account, published in the revised version of his book, which appeared in 1974, Father Bowden had informed him that there had been no reported or observed signs of diabolical possession, nor even of natural possession before the exorcisms began, and that what happened during the exorcism could all be explained by natural or psychological causes. Without impugning the integrity of Father Bowden, Kelly surmised from his interviews with other priests in attendance that Bowden had been honestly mistaken in his belief that the 1949 case was a genuine incident of diabolical possession. In concluding his discussion of this, Kelly remarked soberly, one of the facts of this case which has been brought out into the open, once the facts of this case have been brought out into the open, one would hope that Blatty will reconsider his conviction that the episode demonstrates the reality of demonic possession. Despite this, however, Kelly continued, at all times, once a factual claim to his book are de-escalated, it can be highly recommended for its treatment of the subjects of possession and exorcism. Indeed, in something of a backhanded compliment, Kelly went on to note that Blatty's theology, while certainly not to his less traditional tastes, was sound. Kelly's faint praise of Blatty's novel alerts us that it would be an oversimplification to imply that only theological liberals like Woods, Greeley, and Schroff were negative about The Exorcist and its impact. Indeed, perhaps The Exorcist's most scathing critic, and certainly one who most got under Blatty's skin, came from a very different place and was perhaps the most interesting for a number of reasons, not least keeping his role in keeping alive the novel's core claims about the reality of diabolical possession in modern America. This was the larger-than-life personality of Malachi Martin, and is with his strange case of life imitating art that I'll conclude. While scholars have usually taken Blatty at his word that the character of the older of the two exorcists in his novel, Father Lancaster Meron, was based on the controversial French Jesuit and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, there is another school of thought. That is that the real inspiration was an ex-Jesuit who had also spent time doing archaeology in the Middle East, and who at one time enthused about the theology of de Chardin. This other figure was Malachi Martin, a notorious figure of late 20th century traditionalist American Catholicism, described by the sociologist Michael Cuneo as the netherworld of American Catholicism. Martin's biography, for anyone who's come across it, is highly contested. The Irish-born Jesuit had several claims to fame even before he reinvented himself in the 1970s as a champion of pre-conciliar Catholicism and a media expert in all things Catholic. If you want an interesting YouTube video, Google Malachi Martin. You can see interviews with him on Oprah and that kind of thing. Unraveling the facts behind his past are difficult. As a director of the recent television Island documentary about Martin, Hostage to the Devil, found out, and I highly recommend watching this. It really sort of captures what I'm talking about here. This much can be said for certain, and it informs how one assesses his response to The Exorcist, and indeed his credibility. Martin joined the Jesuits in 1939 and was ordained in 1954. He received a doctorate from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium and completed additional studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at Oxford. He did, in fact, work on the Dead Sea Scrolls and published an extensive 2-volume work entitled The Scribal Character of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1958. This is serious scholarship. This isn't J.M. Allegro, the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross stuff. This is serious scholarship. Around this time, he relocated to Rome, and among other things, including teaching at the Pontifical Biblical Commission, he became the private secretary to Jesuit Cardinal Augustin Bey, a leading figure in the progressive majority at the Second Vatican Council. From this vantage point, Martin was able to observe firsthand the cloak and dagger politics surrounding Pope John the 23rd and the early sessions of the Vatican Council. And in 1964, under the nom de plume of Michael Serafian, he wrote an intriguing and probably highly fictionalized account of the council entitled The Pilgrim, a reference to Pope Paul VI. It is around 1964 that things start getting murkier. During the council, Martin had become the chief informant for the Time magazine correspondent and one-time Jesuit novice, Robert Blair Kaiser, assisting with his award-winning coverage of the Second Vatican Council, as well as the writing of his 1963 book, Inside the Council. However, as Blair was to find out, Martin was one who was not always good to get close to, and alongside providing Kaiser with insights into the personalities and factions within the Vatican, Martin was also conducting an affair with Kaiser's wife, which eventually led to his leaving both Rome and the Jesuits in 1964. Rumours of this had circulated for decades, but it was only in 2002 the whole sordid story appeared in Kaiser's heartbreaking memoir entitled Clerical Error. And this is an awful book. I don't recommend reading it. Relocating to New York in 1966 and working as, among other odd jobs, a taxi driver and donut shop waiter, Martin wrote a series of sensationalist works in which he claimed to expose the corrupt underworld of the Jesuits, alleged satanic ritual abuse in the Catholic Church, Vatican-Soviet political intrigue, as well as penning a work entitled The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church, which sought to provide a wider historical perspective on what he saw as the disastrous outcomes of Vatican II for the Church. Interestingly enough, though, before he did all this, he wrote a book called Jesus Now, which is like Teilhard de Chardin. It's very progressive theology. He had a complete about-face theologically. Writing popular novels alongside conspiracy theory tomes, the line between fact and fiction in Martin's book was always blurred. Regardless, his books became bestsellers, and he was soon a sought-after figure in a subculture of conservative Roman Catholics, which eagerly embraced and promoted all manner of supernatural phenomena, from demonic possession to Marian apparitions, from stigmata to statues of the Madonna weeping blood, as well as embracing a variety of complex conspiracy theories regarding Freemasons, Satanists, Jews, communists, and the Vatican. More importantly, for my purposes here, was that in 1976, Martin cashed in on the Exorcist phenomena by publishing Hostage to the Devil, The Possession and Exorcism of 5 Contemporary Americans. This book, which became a bestseller, vied with Blatty's novel in its claim to be the book on exorcism. And from its opening pages, Martin began putting the boot into Blatty. Over the next 2 decades, Martin was a frequent critic of Blatty's work, calling the film at various times silly and inaccurate. Blatty, for his part, was equally scathing of Martin. In his review of Hostage to the Devil in the Los Angeles Times, he suggested that Martin was giving possession a bad name and that the book was full of errata and drivel. Blatty was not alone in his judgment, and Father Richard Woods, who was approached by journals to basically do a pre-publication review of Hostage to the Devil, later noted how his assessment of Martin's book at the time was that the cases included were fabrications of an inventive but disturbed mind, lacking all psychological, historical, theological, and pastoral credibility. However much Martin and Blatty clearly despised each other, however, they both profited from their alleged expertise, and both ensured that the demonic retained a massive place in popular culture and on the fringes of American Catholicism. Though that is a story for another time. Thank you.